Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the launch of the City of Toronto's 2026 budget and this afternoon's media briefing. My name is Julia Osterman. I am the Chief Communications Officer with the City of Toronto, and I will be moderating today's session. Today marks the official launch of the city's 2026 budget, with a staff-prepared budget focused on affordability, service stability, and long-term financial sustainability. This morning, the Budget Committee was presented with a proposed $18.9 billion operating budget and a $63.1 billion 10-year capital budget and plan, the largest 10-year capital plan in the city's history. The 2026 budget reflects feedback from more than 11,000 residents who participated in consultations last fall. Today's news release and background are available in the city's media room, which is toronto.ca/media. The budget presentation, briefing notes, budget notes, and the 10-year capital plan are also posted in the Budget Committee agenda, with all materials available later today in the city's budget webpage, which is toronto.ca/budget. Joining me today are City Manager Paul Johnson and Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer Steve Conforti. This briefing today is an opportunity for you to ask questions about the presentation delivered this morning by the City Manager and the CFO at the City Budget Committee. For questions specific to individual city divisions, we encourage you to attend the service area presentations at Budget Committee. These will be taking place from Wednesday the 14th through to Friday, January 16th, and our media relations team has the schedule available for you today. If you're unable to address a question during today's session, please email media@toronto.ca, and of course, we'll follow up with you. Now, to ensure that everyone has a fair opportunity to participate, we will take one question and one follow-up per reporter. And if you have additional questions, please rejoin the queue to ensure that others have a chance to also ask their questions. There is a microphone located just over here. And please remember to state your name and outlet before asking your questions. With that, we will open the floor to questions. Thanks for being here.
Hey, it's Victoria Gibson, Toronto Star. I had a question about the land transfer taxes. You guys are projecting revenues of $850 million in land transfer revenue. That's more than the city was projecting to bring in last year. Are you banking on a rebound in the market? Because it doesn't seem that whole gap is made up by the luxury home tax difference. So how did you arrive at that number?
Thank you. So when we look at all of our revenue sources, and specifically land transfer tax, we'll look at the trends through the course of the year. We have seen some trends through the fall that would indicate the projection that we have, coupled with the increase through homes valued greater than $3 million. So through a combination of both that action, which was about $14 million on its own, and then some of the trends that we've seen, we're forecasting $850 million. I will note that is still quite much lower than what we would have had in prior years. I think even just 4 or 5 years ago, we exceeded $1.1 billion in terms of the total amount of revenue brought in by the land transfer tax.
Mm-hmm. And so with that projection, can you walk us through a little bit more about sort of what you consulted when you're saying, that we've seen some trends indicating it will be better? December just saw the 25-year low in sales. So what was it that gave you some indications that it might go back up again?
So what we'll do is we'll look at the amount of revenue we're bringing in on an annual basis. We'll look at how many houses are becoming available on the market, the amount of transactions that are closing, and some of the trends that we're seeing year over year across the board. We also consult with different financial institutions, especially those that we work with as part of our debt syndicate group, and get feedback from them in terms of what projections are on interest rates, what might be happening in the market. And we leverage that information coupled with experience that now dates back over 15 years to bring forward our projections. The other note I will make, we've made a significant change in how we budget land transfer tax about 4 years ago. Traditionally, and when it was first introduced, the funds almost entirely were used to be able to balance operating budget pressures. We've moved and created something that we call a land transfer tax volatility mitigation strategy. It enables us to direct more of those revenues to reserves or capital, giving us the ability to fluctuate what we might see in the market. So when you look at how much is actually being directed to operating, it's less than 800 million that is actually going to operations. And as we do hopefully see trends and increases over time, that'll give us the ability to continue to increase that buffer and that amount that is funding capital programs.
Okay, thanks so much.
Hi, Lane from CBC. I can tilt this up a little bit. Just when we're looking at page 49 of the presentation, just breaking down how all the funding is coming in, and there's the one big pod about reserves. I was hoping you could just explain maybe in layman's terms, what are the reserves and where they come from to help people understand what that money actually is.
Sure, thanks. So every year when we open and begin a budget process, there's always going to be a use of reserve funds. So we use reserves. In many cases, we will allocate funds to a reserve, potentially on an annual basis, and then make a draw from those reserves as they're needed. So if we look at last year's budget, we had about $1.3 billion being drawn from our reserves. There is an increase this year, but that's because of a couple of very specific actions that are happening. One related to the World Cup, where we've been building that reserve over the last couple of years for funds to come out of it. Another one that is really just related to the timing difference between the fiscal year of the federal government and the municipal government here in Toronto, where funds had been received, they were placed in the reserve in the prior year, they're now being drawn out. So technically it's provincial funding, not reserve, and that's about $200 million on its own. So if you compare year over year, 1.3 billion last year is pretty equivalent to what we have this year. If we delve into that, there are budget bridging strategies that we have. It's about $330 million. That total number is actually very consistent with the amount that we drew through budget bridging strategies in last year's budget. Beyond that, you'll see reserve draws associated with our city building fund. We collect those revenues, it goes into our city building fund. We then draw from that reserve to support debt servicing costs. All of the debt servicing costs coming from non-tax or traditional tax areas is about 300 million. We have employee benefits and liabilities reserve that is drawn from, I think that's around about 80 million or so. There's a bunch of other reserves, fleet reserves, there's a bunch of other reserves that we normally use, and that's something you would see in any budget process. And I know there is some questions coming up about reserves. Where you do take funding from reserves, and those reserves themselves are one-time in nature, what you would see is a considerable change in the outlook in the following year, because those reserves would no longer be available. When you look at the outlook that we have in 2027, that opening pressure is about 1.1 billion. It's actually very consistent with the opening pressure we were anticipated heading into this year.
And speaking of next year, how much are you able to incorporate, or are you able to at all, like the New Deal Part 2, when you're looking at these things, and how do you balance those being under discussion while also trying to project for the coming years?
So we can't put anything in right now that's a guarantee, but the projection is just that. So we are projecting that obviously we will, in partnership with the provincial government, be true to each other's word that this was the year to think about where we go next. If you remember back in 2023 and heading into the 2024 budget, in terms of actual at-the-table negotiations, it was 7 weeks. I know the whole process was 10 or 11 weeks, but it was about 7 weeks. Just impossible to create a fully structuralized approach to it. And a lot of questions from the provincial government about what we were doing in order to ensure our budgets were in great shape. So what we've done is we've anticipated that the kinds of investments that the provincial government and in some cases the federal government, but primarily the provincial government have made, that in some way, shape or form, those will continue. Will they be the exact things that happened in version 1.0 continued? It might not be. It might be in different areas. But as I mentioned this morning, the fundamental differences in Toronto's budget from other municipalities, because this has always been about what's unique about Toronto, is the considerable cost we have in this city related to transit. You see it on DCs. 42% of our development charges go towards transit. There is no other city in the province of Ontario, even Ottawa, that has increased dramatically their rapid transit, doesn't come close to 42%. And then on the operating side, we operate a system that is simply it is the biggest in Canada, and it is simply different than every other municipality, given the fact we also have that subway system. So that's not going anywhere. The investments we make in things like housing and shelters aren't going anywhere. And some of the pressures we're seeing on our emergency services are truly unique to Toronto. So we'll continue to put those on the table. The goal of 2026 is find a way that this isn't another 1, 2, 3-year deal. It actually is something that's structurally different for it. So yes, we put a placeholder in that really looks at what we have now. That will change through 2026 as we actually get in and finalize those discussions.
Aiden from Toronto Today, Mr. Conforti, just a real quick clarification on the reserve thing. So the delta between 25 and 26, that roughly 300 or 400 million, that you're saying that's from almost exclusively from like these anomalies that you're talking about.
Yeah, so there is about a $400 million delta. That delta itself has no impact or isn't associated with the budget bridging strategies that we brought forward as part of the budget this year.
Okay, and then a very small question. The 2026 budget says that the 2025 budget was $18.7 billion, but the 2025 budget says it was 18.8. What's going on there?
Yeah, I was expecting that question. So the budget's approved. It doesn't stay that way for the course of the year. There's various adjustments that happen throughout the year. Within our gross spending, there were adjustments within the year. There was a very technical adjustment that reduced the expenditures, and I'm happy to get into it. I might bore you all. It was more of an accounting adjustment, but that was what was driving the number down. So what we do when we're comparing it to the final adjusted budget, because that is the budget we're building on as we then bring forward the 2026 budget.
And then, sorry, I was just kind of half listening when you were talking about this in committee. You mentioned
Half listening to our CFO.
I was typing as well. I was
Alright.
typing as well.
I appreciate your honesty.
Yeah.
last
You
question.
mentioned shelter costs going dramatically down. Is that just from hotels, shelters, kind of getting wrapped up?
Well, not just hotels. It's a drop in the number of people who are in the shelter system, primarily the result of lower numbers of refugee and asylum seekers. So at our peak, we were about 12,500 beds, which included 6,500 or so at the refugee and asylum seeker side of the shelter system. Now we have about 3,100 refugee and asylum seekers and are down to about 9,200 in shelter beds. So that's where you see the difference. And then on top of that, there's some structural reductions as we've exited some of our shelter hotels, which are dramatically more expensive than our purpose-built facilities.
Hi, Ben Cohen, Toronto Star. Can you provide some examples of what kind of capital work is being deferred and by how long?
So in terms of capital work, I think if you're specific to the development charge areas.
Yeah.
So as we looked at our development charges and the amount coming in, we'll look at the different revenue streams that are coming in across different eligible services. As we looked at that, the primary area that was going to be impacted, that was at risk, was the development charges coming in for our parks and recreation area. So we have a deferral of mostly community center projects. So what we would be doing, and for the most part, you're looking at almost a cascading deferral across the entire plan, where project 1 may get pushed out 18 months and project 2 and so on and so forth. So there is a whole list of those projects that have come in. I believe it's 200 million and change worth of deferrals that you see across the 10-year program as a result of that.
And I think earlier you said the hiring freeze will impact the capacity to support the delivery of some services and initiatives. Can you clarify how?
So at this point, it's a risk. So we, in the latter part of 2025, when some of our financial situations were such that we were no longer projecting a surplus, we instituted this. Now that we're having it go through all of 2026, there is the potential that is we look to meet our target on that hiring slowdown. It could have some impacts on service delivery. Our commitment to council is, because this is a full year initiative, we'd be bringing those there. There may not be any, but the reality is we can't guarantee that this type of a slowdown won't eventually provide the impact the support to the programs. Important to note that word support. So this is not about frontline positions. Those are either exempt or they're being approved to move forward in the slowdown. These would be some of those, it could be, policy-related positions that might support the way we deliver our service. It could be some of the administrative pieces that might slow down some of the timing that happens with some of these services. Those are the types of impacts we'd be looking at. Important to note, this is not a hiring freeze in terms of we can't hire people. It is a slowdown to say we are going to examine non-essential positions and continue to work towards a saving in 2026.
Thank you.
Hey, Isaac from Global News. On the Bill 17 deferrals, that money is deferred rather than not coming in, so why didn't the city consider debt financing those projects to keep them on time and then repaying that debt through the development charges when they came in?
So it is an option. When we look at our capital program, we do have a $60 billion capital program. There are various funding sources that we look at within our capital program. We also have to anticipate how much debt can we issue in any given year? What is the market willing to bear? How do we maintain within our 15% debt service guideline? So all of that work is done, and as we do that work, we're generally doing that through the lens of ensuring we're making investments in our state of good repair needs to be able to maintain the existing assets that we have, and then leveraging growth funding tools to be able to support the growth projects. The plan that we have today is already maximizing a reasonable amount of debt, an amount of debt that the city can manage and absorb within the revenues that we have. As it relates to the development charges, it isn't just Bill 17. You're seeing market downtrends essentially right now. You're seeing substantially less development charge revenue coming in today compared to what might have seen just 5 years ago. But then you couple that with the 3 to 4 year average delay that you'll see in terms of the collection of DCs, and it means this down period we're experiencing may get extended as far as 6 years out. And at the same time, we have about $6.5 billion in critical growth enabling infrastructure that needs to be built. And that's the tension that gets created through this. And then managing and really prioritizing the work that we do and which projects we're able to support.
So it used to be the case that municipalities would complain that developers would sit before pulling building permits to get projects off the ground. With these Bill 17 changes, are you concerned developers are going to wait to pull occupancy permits and therefore leave you holding out for development charges?
I don't know that we have an answer for that. Hopefully that's not something that happens, but yeah, so I don't know. It's not something we're concerned about at the moment.
Hey guys, Momin Qureshi, 680 News Radio. In the past, you both have, in previous budgets, talked about the need to be prudent and not be short-sighted, kind of look long-term. The property tax rate here is 2.2% if you include the building levy. Just wanted to ask whether you think, given the situation the city's in, billion-dollar budget gap, all that kind of stuff, is it prudent to have a property tax rate this low? Can the city handle it, or are we just kind of kicking the can down the road to potential bigger problems in the future?
I'll start. So, I think the balance this year and the priority balance was affordability and the need to continue on our financial path. I would have not felt comfortable if this created a backswing towards the $1.8 billion apiece. So we've chosen affordability for the city, given a whole bunch of things that are going on over, driving down that opening pressure number. It's a number that's clearly manageable because we managed it this year. So, I think that was what, when we talked to the mayor and we're given some of the direction, it was about that affordability lens to it. And those are things that happen. It's the same way somebody could argue, how the heck could you ever decide to run an average $2.1 billion opening pressure during the pandemic? Well, the reality is we couldn't shut down our transit system. We had some pressures on it. So I think we're in a pretty unique time in Toronto. I think we can handle that. We need to continue to work on the plan. And the plan includes a reasonable amount of property tax increases coming year by year to take care of our piece from the City of Toronto. We need other orders of government to come along and work with us. And as a public service, we need to continue to find a way to be as effective and efficient in our operations. So yes, I think we can sustain this, or else we wouldn't have recommended this as staff as well. But I think it's important to say the trade-off this year was that affordability, going deeper on affordability, versus deeper on that opening pressure. And you can contrast that to 2024, where clearly we needed to make much more of a dent on the opening pressure, and you saw a much larger tax increase in that year.
And just based on some of the answers we got from the mayor and the budget chief and even from the TTC CEO yesterday, a lot of talk about the new deal that's coming, and potentially a lot of confidence in what's coming. You guys are at the table. Is that confidence well placed? Do you feel like the city is going to get what it needs here to avoid some sort of financial setback or disaster?
So my confidence is that we continue to have an excellent working relationship with the province, despite occasionally disagreeing with direction as they do with us. The relationship is excellent. I will say from the day we signed and the mayor and the premier stood up on the first new deal, the work that's happened between the public service on both sides has been tremendous. And we've had to do a lot of work and move a lot of things forward beyond the headline grabbing pieces back in 2023 about the operating investments and the Gardner upload. There's lots of things within that we've been working on. So I think the fact that we both agreed within the New Deal 1.0 to put in this provision that we would absolutely sit down and talk about it means that we can be confident there's a desire to do that. All negotiations are tough, and what I will say is, as much as we are talking today about the financial pressures that the city's facing and Torontonians are facing, the province is facing those same things. They have a land transfer tax, and so they're facing some of those pressures. They are seeing the impact of tariffs and its result on the economic situation. So we both sit at the table understanding pressures, but I think we both understand that Toronto needs to succeed, and I see no indication from where I sit that the province isn't committed to getting there. But I will also say, as it was in 2023, it's not an easy path. We'll have to spend a good chunk of time in 2026 making it happen.
Ben Spur from the Toronto Star. Just back to the reserves issue. I thought I caught a reference this morning to a specific a bridging reserve that was completely drawn down. Can you elaborate on that? Is there a reserve that has been completely used up here, or what?
So the budget bridging reserve had been created really following the pandemic. So we had built up that COVID backstop during the pandemic, and starting in the 2024 budget process with that large pressure, we started to slowly draw down that backstop, which we had created and placed in a budget bridging reserve, was the name of the reserve. So we drew that down in 2024. We further drew it down in 2025. And as part of the 2026 budget process, two actions have happened. One, through some efforts that we had as part of to be able to create additional surplus in 2025 based on some direction that went out in the fall to staff here at the city, we were able to increase a bit of surplus achieved in 2025, allocated that to the reserve, and then coupled with that, the balance that was remaining was drawn down as part of this year's budget.
So by drawn down, you mean used up?
Completely used up.
So it's safe to say the COVID backstop that was in place a few years ago has now been completely
Yes.
used up. Okay. And there's also a reference to filling that opening shortfall with a capital from current adjustments. So is that like some people around here seem to think that that's like starving a capital budget or just kind of a shell game where you're shifting money from the operating ledger over to the capital ledger? Can you just explain a little bit what's going on there?
Yeah, so capital from current is where our operating budget provides direct funding to support capital initiatives. What we've done is we've reviewed many areas across the city this year as part of financing adjustments, where we are paying for capital assets that may have a 10, 20, 30-year life, but we're expensing them in the current year operating budget. Capital from current is essentially one example of where that happens. What we've done is we've looked at the capacity that we have within our capital funding tools, debt issuance, city building fund, capacity that's available there, and determined where that capacity existed to be able to continue to deliver on that capital work, but deliver it in a way where we're expensing it over the life or term of the debt we would issue, which would be aligned with the life of the asset, rather than incurring the expense in the first year in 2026, rather than over the next 10, 20, or 30 years.
If I have just one one more. There was a reference in the shortfall strategy to street lighting investments. Can you elaborate on what's going on?
So that is somewhat consistent with the capital financing adjustments. So we work closely, obviously, with Toronto Hydro. There was a contribution that was in our transportation services budget to provide $25 or $20 million or so every year towards street lighting. In conversations that we've had with Hydro staff, it became very evident that much like many assets in municipalities, our street lighting assets were deteriorating, they were aging, and there was a need to increase the investment towards street lighting. So we had conversations and worked out an arrangement where we would provide direct capital funding to be able to fund those street lightings. So the change that you see is us making an added investment in street lighting repair, but at the same time removing that operating expense, which had been our contribution to Hydro. So it provides some operating relief.
Hey, Isaac from Global again. On the FIFA issue, could you give us an update on what the top line number is that the city will be paying for FIFA, and what maybe 2 or 3 of the biggest drivers of that main number are?
So important to recognize we share the entire budget, but I'm going to give you the two sides to that answer. So the budget for FIFA is $380 million. The City of Toronto is not investing $380 million to that. It's a cost-shared agreement across 3 levels of government. So I think the City of Toronto share is somewhere in the $170 to $180 million range of that. And I think it's important to say both of that, because occasionally people feel it's 380 plus what the federal government and provincial government isn't. No, but it's our games, so it's 380. The major drivers on that are capital. About 170 or so million of that is the capital investments we're making, both at Toronto Stadium, as it will be called, BMO Field as we know it now, and then at Centennial Park for the training pitch that will be there through FIFA, and then transforming that into a soccer hub in Etobicoke for the future of the games. And then the other pieces is the game day operations. The 6 World Cup matches in Toronto do have a cost on a day-by-day, on a game-by-game basis, which is significant. These are think about it as each one of these is kind of like a Super Bowl experience on the day, with the level of fan operations that needs to go in, getting the spectators in, obviously the security and all the other infrastructure and the transportation pieces. So those 6 matches are the next biggest expense, and then there's just a few little things that go on. The third biggest one would obviously be FanFest, which will be the place where probably most Torontonians would have an option to join in the festivities. So that's what's happened. We're still remaining true to that $380 million and looking forward to a tremendous games in less than 6 months now, so it's great.
And so I just wanted to clarify, because that 380 figure, there was a while where basically every time you updated council, it had increased significantly. Is that 380 likely the final figure then? You're not going to come to council with an updated ask?
So it's been 380 for a while, and it's been more than a year now since it's changed. So that's where we're at. And the mayor was very clear. She said, when we made the adjustment, and much of the adjustment was the 6th match, we had said 5 or 6, and when it became 6, it boosted that up a little bit, and then there was some pressures on our capital side, but the 380 is what the mayor has asked us to keep to, and so far so good.
And then, sorry, just finally, have you calculated out the indirect cost? Because presumably the taxpayer will be funding more paramedic calls, more police calls, more road closures, more traffic staff on the streets. Have you calculated out what those overtime costs, etc., will come to for FIFA?
So in the case of FIFA, like some of the other big events we do, though, some of those costs are embedded within it. So for instance, transportation plans and things like that have been factored into the FIFA budget, so there wouldn't be an incremental piece to that. Obviously, hosting games like this, the amount of people that will be there will be pressure, even just things like litter pickup. There's probably going to have to be extra pieces like that. A full costing of that is hard to fully understand. The other side, though, is that there's also a trade-off. During that period, we will have less other events happening in the city. So some of that is going to be the swings and roundabouts of summer in Toronto, which always has this pressure to it. So will there be some slight incremental costs in some of our divisions? Probably. But they're not significant enough. And some of the big costs associated with that, policing and the security and all that, is part of the FIFA budget. So we don't have to worry about that showing up somewhere else on our budget sheet.
Aiden from Toronto Today again. You guys were talking about how Toronto's DCs are largely made up of transit, which is fairly unique. The feds have the new Building Canada Strong fund or whatever it is, and they've said they want to get DCs down, and they're open to this fund being used on any kind of infrastructure. So is it your understanding that that fund could be used to pay for things like transit and potentially something like the waterfront LRT or something like that?
So we're not fully clear what all that means, and they're building it, and that's not a knock on the federal government. This is a brand new program, so they're getting it up and going. We've been fairly consistent to share with both the provincial and federal government. We think one of the easiest ways for the City of Toronto to commit the kinds of incentives on DCs that we did successfully with about the 8,000 units that came forward is to look at infrastructure swaps. So if, for instance, a project, you talk about Waterfront East Rapid Transit, we're collecting DCs for that. If that project was to be fully funded through a transit initiative or other types of infrastructure initiatives, we would then be able to look at how those DCs could be used in a different way to lower that cost so we can continue to build housing. And we've even presented models of looking at how major amounts of infrastructure funding that's kind of guaranteed for a few big projects would allow us to greatly reduce the DCs for a long period of time. In fact, the 10-year horizon of our capital plan. So our hope is we continue to talk to other levels of government about the fact that, development charges are pretty straightforward. It's one of the major tools we have around infrastructure. If someone can find a different way around the infrastructure, Steve doesn't get up every morning wanting to just charge more DCs. Steve wants to make sure that our infrastructure funding is done right from a growth perspective, but also from an SOGR perspective. And if there's better ways to fund the growth-related infrastructure, we can address the DC issue that's come up repeatedly from other orders of government and the development community. So that's what we're hoping we'll see from Build Canada Homes. It's what we're hoping to see just in general with infrastructure funding that's coming from the federal government and the provincial government, is use that to our advantage to complete projects. And the other piece is, again, it's completing projects we all agree are important projects, transit projects, some of the housing enabling infrastructure that we need. You look at something like a Downsview and some of those other big projects we have. How can we work together? We think we've got lots of opportunities to work with other orders of government on projects they want and find a way that we can then translate that into DC incentives, which will help spur the housing along.
Hey, Victoria from the Star again. A question about state of good repair. TCHC for a number of years has had quite a chunk of federal funding for state of good repair. I understand that that's uncertain from 27 onward. Are you building any contingencies into this year's budget because of that uncertainty, or how are you confronting that from the budgetary perspective?
Yeah, so you're speaking about there was a co-investment between the City of Toronto and the federal government as it related to being able to advance state of good repair work on Toronto community housing. At the point in time, the city made a commitment to $1.6 billion being added to the 10-year capital plan. I think if memory serves me, there was about $1.3 billion in funding that was coming through partly a grant and partly a loan from CMHC through the federal government. That program ends, I believe it's 2028, I think it's 2028 that program ends. The city's commitment not only continues, we've actually increased our commitment. So if I look at the budget right now, I believe it's $1.9 billion in state of good repair funding. So we've maintained that $160 million a year, and we've actually topped that amount up. Even when we had the Gardner upload last year, we took a pretty large portion of the funds that were freed up from the Gardner upload and redirected it to address and continue to address the housing needs that we have related to state of repair. The challenge that we're facing is all of these actions have delivered the results we were hoping for. We were starting to see what they term as the facility condition index, essentially how well are they performing in terms of a state of repair. It was coming down closer to the targets that we needed it to come through these joint investments. The situation we're facing now is beyond 2028, those condition indexes are starting to creep back up to the level before we started this initiative. So it's imperative that us as a city continue to look and prioritize investments in housing. But as I mentioned today at Budget Committee, all of these actions that we as a city are taking, we've almost doubled our capital plan in the last 10 years alone to the point where it's now above $60 billion. We need our intergovernmental partners to come to the table and provide stacking funding against many of these infrastructure investments that benefit far more than just the City of Toronto.
Our last few questions.
I apologize, this is going to be a bit thick. Matt from Global News. I just want to clarify with the budget gap, because in previous years, I know legislatively you have to pass a budget that's balanced, but in previous years, Toronto has passed one with a budget hole still unfunded under the understanding that the federal government, provincial government may come through with that funding or is expected to. So I just wanted to clarify that with the $1.3 billion or so, that reserve funds at the end of this process will be plugging that hole, and that it will be a balanced budget at the end of it, or do you still have to find funds somewhere at the end of this process?
Yeah, so I'm going to tackle this in a couple of points. I think first, in prior years, when we brought forward a budget that did have an expectation in federal or provincial funding tied to it, that expectation also held a contingency behind it. So the extent that they didn't come forward, I believe it was during COVID, it was sometimes we did that as it related to some shelter funding from the federal government, we had a provision held back. So our budget still would have been balanced, and ultimately, if we weren't successful in obtaining any of those funding agreements, we would have leveraged that provision that we had set aside. Moving forward in this year's budget, there is no uncertainty in terms of the funding. The funding coming in matches the expenditures that we have. We have a balanced budget. The challenge that persists and the challenge that we've been facing since 2024 is we've taken this longer multi-year view to budgeting in a way that the decisions that we're making today, we're considering the impacts that they're going to have in future years. Gives us that lens to be able to take actions today that are going to achieve benefits in future years, just like the 2026 budget is benefiting from actions that would have started in 2024 in terms of achieving savings. As Paul had mentioned earlier, we are looking at the impacts of the decisions we're making this year and how does that manifest in terms of pressures for 2027, where we have a $1.1 billion pressure, which is relatively consistent with the opening pressure we were facing heading into 2025.
I do want to, stress that some of those gaps in the past were to do with refugee and asylum seekers. It tended to be in that realm a lot. We've had a few times. I know my predecessor, Chris Murray, had one of those scenarios that he had to do a number of years ago. And we're really, very pleased that we've been able to work with the federal government to find a pathway that works. So we don't enter into our 2026 budget year with that with that conflict in place where it's really like, okay, well, we've passed our budget, now you've got to fill the hole. We've come up to that agreement. And part of that agreement is to allow us a runway to build the kind of system at the right size for particularly the refugee and asylum seeker piece of our work that actually is going to match on an ongoing basis the level of funding from the federal government. So not only are we dealing with today's problem and today's issue, and thankfully we've come to an agreement on that, the good news is we have a pathway forward operationally that the federal government fully supports. So, you can never predict for years and years it's going to be there. Policies change and programs change, but I just want to say on the refugee and asylum seeker piece, a big word of thanks to the federal government for understanding our unique position in Toronto. And I keep using that terminology because there just are some times where it's unique to Toronto. I want to thank them for looking at that, because had we not, the hole that we were potentially looking at would have had to be filled. Quite frankly, it wouldn't have had a contingency, so it would have been filled with very dramatic changes to service, which would have impacted people. So the good news is that we don't have to worry about it in our budget as a whole that has to be filled. And the second piece is we can work with families and individuals in a very compassionate way to make sure that we can get to a size of a system that works for Toronto.
Okay, so because the New Deal has been brought up a couple times, is it fair to say to avoid having one of those contingency plans, you need to have that sorted out before the budget period next year?
Yeah, so the good news is that we've got a long runway and we all agree and we have a time frame and we've got it in writing that we will talk. The reality is heading into 2027, it's going to seem an awful lot like 2023 heading into 2024. We need that support, otherwise dramatic actions would need to be taken. But the context under which we're going to enter into these discussions is very different. We agree we need to sit down. We agree we need to figure a pathway through. Should something materialize that would not happen, you're right. But that's a 2027 hole. I think the important piece of what Steve just said is there is no hole to which we have to do some work in the next 60, 90 days to fill, or else we've got to go back to council and say we've got a problem with the existing budget. We have a budget that's fully balanced with no contingency hole to fill.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions today. Just wanted to remind everyone there are a few dates in the budget process over the next coming weeks, and these are included in the media backgrounder. So the city will host telephone town halls on Wednesday, January 14th and Thursday, January 15th. There are public presentations to the Budget Committee on Tuesday, January 20th and Wednesday, the 21st. The Budget Committee's wrap-up meeting is scheduled for Friday, January 23rd. The mayor's budget will be released by February 1st at the latest, and that's followed by a special city council meeting to consider the budget on Tuesday, February 10th. Thank you so much for attending.